According to the rabbis, the divine law is not immutable. On the contrary, the Torah is susceptible to moral critique and modification, and the fact that it is so is the very mark of its divinity. How does this work? Sometimes the rabbis will state that what the divine law is, and after doing that say, but we're not going to do that. We're setting it aside in favor of a better ruling, better in the sense of morally better, usually. We see this, for example, in Mishnah 18, 4, and 5, which list a whole series of ordinances that adjust the divine law for the sake of the social order, or for the public welfare, tikkun ha'olam, etc. For example, although by formal Torah law, a husband is empowered to annul a divorce document without his wife's knowledge, the rabbis rule that he may not do so for the sake of the social order. But they take pains to explicitly say, by Torah law, the person is allowed to do this. But we're not going to let them do that. We think there's a better thing to do. Although a slave freed by one of his two masters is technically half free, the rabbis compel his other master to free him for the sake of the social order, since otherwise the man can't marry. In short, for the rabbis, divine law does not always dictate the best and most desirable answer, and humans are essential partners in critiquing the law and making it better, usually based on some intuitive sense that the law is just wrong. In fact, the rabbis maintain that humans have the power to critique and modify a divine decree. Some texts are quite explicit in their aggressive criticism of the divine law as morally inferior, and there are some fascinating sources that describe God being corrected by the moral insights and arguments of humans. One scholar, Dovweiss, has just written a book where he looks at 140 confrontational texts from the 3rd to the 7th centuries, in which humans openly confront God for the moral blindness of a particular divine law or decree. In these texts, various characters, human characters, expose the moral imperfection, if you will, of God. Sometimes God rejects or ignores the critique. They don't always win, but sometimes, significantly, he courageously admits his flaws and he adopts the more ethical stance proposed by his human interlocutor, modifies his behavior, his decree, or his law in response. In the text 13, which is from Numbers Rabbah, a late Midrash, God concedes to Moses' criticism of the principle of vicarious punishment, or intergenerational punishment. When the Holy One, blessed be He, said to Moses, in the course of giving Moses the Torah, that he visits the guilt of the parents upon the children, right? This is God's self-introduction in Exodus 34. Moses said, wait a minute, master of the world, how many evil people give birth to righteous people? Shall they take punishment from the sins of their parents? Terah worshipped idols. Abraham, his son, was righteous. Also, Hezekiah was righteous. His father Ahaz was a wicked man, etc. Is it appropriate that righteous people shall receive lashes for the sins of their parents? And God said to him, you've taught me something by your life. I will nullify my decree and establish your word. So Moses expresses moral outrage over the principle of transgenerational punishment. God learns from him, annuls his decree, and establishes a new rule of individual punishment. In another instance, Moses teaches God that it's best to sue for peace before engaging in war, and God is said to adopt his policy, the policy in place of his earlier decree of making war without first attempting negotiations. Other rabbinic passages contain human criticism and divine concession. It's because Abraham expresses moral doubt about the flood that God decides to moderate his behavior in the case of Sodom and Gomorrah. In another text, God learns a lesson in compassion and altruism from Leah. In another, Moses objects to the severity of the punishment of stoning to death for certain sins, so God revokes the punishment and institutes lashes or flagellation instead of capital punishment. So in these cases, the rabbis present modifications of divine behavior or divine law by the divine legislator as the result of human input and revision. It's a short distance from the view that God consents to and is desirous of human assistance in modifying the strict justice of his own decrees to the view that he needs it. And a dramatic illustration of God's dependence on human intervention to defeat him in the execution of his own flawed decrees is found in our last text. This is from Midrash Exodus Rabbah 43:4. This is referring to the golden calf story. Let me give you the context first. According to the biblical story, of course, in Exodus 32, God is infuriated by the Israelites' disloyalty, their worship of the golden calf, and he declares his intention to wipe them out completely. He will start again with Moses. So he orders Moses to stand aside so that my anger can blaze forth and I can destroy them. But Moses doesn't. The text says that instead, he begins to implore God not to destroy the people. And this is where the Rabbinic Midrash then picks up. According to the Rabbinic Midrash, God desperately wants to forgive Israel, but he can't. He's trapped by his law, condemning idolaters to death. So Moses, he says, I've already taken an oath back there in Exodus 22, 10 chapters ago, you will recall. I made a law there that says whoever sacrifices to a god other than the Lord alone shall be prescribed, shall be destroyed. I can't retract an oath which has proceeded from my mouth, God says in the Midrash. Right? This is the Midrash's construction of the story of this moment. Thinking quickly, Moses says, but wait a minute. In Numbers 30, coming up, you grant scholars the ability to absolve the oaths of people who bring a petition for the absolution of the oath and express regret. If they regret what they've done, realize they've made a mistake. And so, why don't you do that? Since a good teacher should always model his rules for his students. You should be the first to avail yourself of this particular law in Numbers 30. So having persuaded God to this course of action, Moses prepares to hear God's petition. And the Midrash then goes on to describe the very dramatic scene. That's text 14. Thereupon Moses wrapped himself in his cloak. So in other words, now he's acting like a rabbinic sage. So he puts on his tali, like a sage who's sitting and waiting for a petitioner to come, hat in hand, to ask for the absolution of his vow. And he seated himself like a sage. And the Holy One, blessed be he, stood before him like one petitioning for the annulment of his vow. I love picturing this, What did Moses say to him? A shocking thing. Do you now regret your vow? And he said to him, I regret now the evil which I said I would do to my people. When Moses heard this, he said, it's absolved for you, it is absolved for you. There is neither vow nor oath any longer. And he absolved the vow of his creator. It's actually a wonderful pun on the language of the story. But it's an astonishing portrait of God trapped by his own law of justice and true judgment and dependent upon the ingenious intervention of a human partner in order to escape the dictates of his divine law. So these texts from the 3rd to 7th century depict a fallible God, capable of error, and at times in need of moral instruction by humans. Many people assume that the Talmudic rabbis could never have seen God as less than morally perfect and open, or see him as open to being corrected or subverted or defeated by humans. But these texts suggest otherwise. Indeed, God is even said to need and delight in such defeats. The idea of a morally evolving divine being, whose law should be subjected to moral critique and modified if necessary, stands at a great distance from Greco-Roman conceptions of divinity and the fixed and unchanging divine or natural law. To modify divine law on the basis of practical reason, phronesis, or considerations of equity or mercy or just good rhetorical argument would have been just sort of nonsensical in a Greco-Roman context. In Hellenistic thought, the perfect natural or divine law is an expression of a uniform, inflexible, unchanging order, always universally valid. It just makes no sense to speak of its adjustment, rather like saying, well, let's adjust the law of gravity. It just doesn't make sense. In fact, Greco-Roman natural law theory envisages the opposite, right? The critique and the modification of human positive laws, the laws of states, in the light of the immutable divine natural law. There are certain things that states, they just can't establish as laws because they would violate natural law, so you would disable them. But in a paradoxical reversal, rabbinic sources depict the critique and modification of the divine law, the Torah, in the light of human experience and intuition. It's the divine law that's adjusted on the basis of human wisdom, not human law on the basis of divine wisdom or perspective. And the divine law changes and evolves, not because it's imperfect actually, but because it's perfect. A rigid, unresponsive law would be imperfect for the governance of God's world. And that's an important and radical idea. The rational modification of the law and the implied fallibility of the divine lawgiver did not negate the law's divinity or authority in the eyes of the rabbis. That's because biblical and rabbinic tradition locate their God not in static, uniform nature, or not only there, but in dynamic history. God is intimately involved in and responsive to changing historical circumstances and moral considerations. The divine law's perfection is not diminished by the fact that it's particular, flexible, or responsive, rather than universal, static, and uniform. Its perfection is constituted by those features, and humans are active participants and necessary partners with God in the ongoing evolution of his Torah.